In this module, we shall be discussing the right to property, the evolution of the right to property, and the interactions between the right to property and economic development. For this purpose, we shall be studying three jurisdictions: the United Kingdom, India, and the United States. They are all common law jurisdictions. Before we discuss the evolution of the right to property in various jurisdictions, it is critical to understand what property is. Simply put, property is a bundle of rights over which the owner has the rights of free use, enjoyment, and disposal. Property has also been considered as the fruit of labor and as a creation of man. Therefore, the right to property has been seen as a natural right. One of the main proponents of this theory is Locke, who felt that the right to property is a natural right vested in an individual even in the absence of state. Montesquieu, on the other hand, saw the right to property as a product of civil laws. The right to property has been recognized in various international instruments. For example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 17, recognizes the right of every individual to own property and not to be arbitrarily deprived of property. The European Charter of Human Rights, Article 1 of the First Protocol, also recognizes the right to property. The constitutions of most jurisdictions contain a right that gives protection to property. That is to say, the right of the state to acquire property belonging to an individual is circumscribed. The right to property, like most other rights enjoyed by individuals, are not absolute. The right can be sacrificed if the needs of the community so require. So it can in a certain sense be seen as a state right, and the people can decide what disposition is to be made of it. In this theory, all natural resources belong to the state, which is a manifestation of the people. This is also in line with the notion of sovereignty of the state. Therefore, the title of individuals to land is derived from the state. Thus, the state can acquire property for a number of purposes. The power of the state to do so is known as the power of eminent domain. It refers to the right and the inherent power of the state to appropriate private property within its boundaries to public use. Thus, property can be compulsorily acquired by the state without the owner's consent using this power. Historically, this power has been utilized for acquiring property required for public uses such as public facilities, public utilities, highways, railroads, etc. Traditionally, when property has been acquired by the state using its power of eminent domain, the individual affected by such acquisition has been compensated by the state. The state can also impose restrictions on the use of property by individuals. Now let's look at the link between the right to property and the state's developmental agenda. A very broad right to property has been seen in most jurisdictions as restricting the right of the state to engage in urban planning, land reforms, etc. So some states have abolished the right to property, or restricted the application of the right, or made the amount of compensation payable for an acquisition non-justiciable. We shall now look at some of these jurisdictions which have done so. The first jurisdiction we shall take up for consideration is the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom presents a rather curious case for study when it comes to the right to property. In the UK, the right to property has been protected through what can be described as parliamentary conventions, customs, or practices. Our earliest source of English constitutional ideas are Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England. The right to property was considered by Blackstone as a part of the fundamental law. Thus, it couldn't be violated even for the benefit of the entire community. But in his commentary, Blackstone mentions that private property was often compulsorily acquired by the state. Such acquisitions had to obtain legislative authorization from the parliament and had to be in the public interest and on payment of compensation. Interestingly, there is no reference to any power of eminent domain. Blackstone wrote that when the Parliament compulsorily acquired private property, the owners of such property were invariably compensated for the loss suffered by them due to such acquisition. But this did not create any justiciable legal obligation on the Parliament to do so. In other words, if the Parliament did not provide for compensation in the legislation authorizing the acquisition, the affected individual had no remedy in law. English courts have also held that in the absence of a statutory claim for compensation, there is no common law right to compensation. Even in the absence of the power of constitutional judicial review to invalidate legislations or to force the Parliament to pay compensation when it deprives an individual of his or her property rights, the United Kingdom has had a reputation for giving strong protection to property rights. But it must be noted that the power of the Parliament to authorize compulsory acquisitions has been used very liberally. In practice, it's been used to confer the power of expropriation even on private enterprises as long as there is a benefit to the public. Thus, in the UK, through the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, a number of public works and utilities were undertaken by private entrepreneurs. The Crown was often not directly involved in such activities. What used to happen was that a private entrepreneur would prepare a scheme for carrying out a public work or activity, and where property was to be acquired for carrying out of this scheme, the acquisition was authorized through a private act of Parliament after consideration of the scheme. Usually, compensation was payable under such a private act. In the case of a dispute regarding the amount of compensation, the private legislation often required parties to refer disputes to a sheriff's jury. This position was not satisfactory and led to the introduction of the Land Clauses Consolidation Act of 1845, which provided a standard set of clauses for legislation authorizing such compulsory acquisitions. Firstly, it gave the landowner the option of referring the issue of compensation to an arbitration instead of referring it to the jury. Secondly, there were parliamentary procedures for obtaining a private act, which made sure that a public case had to be made that the conferral of the power of expropriation was in the public interest. Of course, public interest was given a very broad meaning, such that private entrepreneurs who hope to earn profits would be permitted, would be granted the power of expropriation as long as the services or the activity that the private entrepreneur undertook was important enough to constitute a public benefit. The courts also took a broad view of public purpose, validating acquisitions as long as there was a general interest of the community in the purpose for which the property was sought to be acquired. Once the United Kingdom signed the European Convention of Human Rights, it had to protect the property rights of its citizens in accordance with Article 1 of the First Protocol. This article provides for the protection of property rights by prohibiting the deprivation of property except in the public interest and in accordance with conditions provided for by law and general principles of international law. This convention became a part of English domestic law with the enactment of the Human Rights Act in 1998. Thus, the HRA provided a framework for the protection of property rights, which gave courts power similar to judicial review. This power with the courts was, of course, very limited. If the parliamentary legislation is considered as inconsistent with the ECHR, then the court could only declare that it is inconsistent. It did not have the power to invalidate the legislation. It was then left to the Parliament to take appropriate steps to correct the inconsistency. Thus, one can see that the property rights regime in the UK has evolved from being founded on parliamentary practices or conventions to having some sort of constitutional backing in the form of the Human Rights Act and the Human Rights Act. Of course, it is also seen that the definition of public purpose has been very widely interpreted so as to enable the development agenda of the government to succeed. In India, the right to property has had a very uneven and controversial trajectory. It has seen several constitutional amendments and judicial decisions. So, in India, prior to the colonial rule, land was held in accordance with different systems of tenure which varied across regions. So, while it's not true of all regions, land used to be concentrated in the hands of certain sections of people. We shall refer to them as zamindars. The property rights regime in India, as we know it today, was put in place during the colonial rule. Once the British came to India, they needed land for various infrastructure projects. Therefore, they put in place different regulations for acquisition of land for different regions. Eventually, this was all consolidated in the form of a uniform legislation, Act 6 of 1857, which applied to all territories that were under the governance of the East India Company. Later on, in 1894, the British enacted the Land Acquisition Act, which amended and unified land acquisition laws in British India. Now, while drafting a constitution for independent India, there was a great deal of debate on the degree of protection to be given to property rights. It was feared that a strong property rights regime would also protect the landed zamindar class in whose hands the land was concentrated, thereby harming the interests of tenants. It should be noted that at the time of India's independence, landowners controlled about 43% of the land in India. There was unanimity on the fact that there should be an abolition of the zamindari system. However, the manner in which it was to be abolished, there was a great deal of debate on that. So while one faction led by Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel believed that there should be strong protection for property rights with a right to full compensation for the zamindars where land was acquired by the state, the other faction led by Jawaharlal Nehru disagreed. The latter, influenced by socialist principles, wanted to dismantle the zamindari system and effect large-scale redistribution of property and nationalization of industries without the payment of compensation. This was because, in the case of state legislation enabling the abolition of zamindari system, there was a concern that if just compensation was guaranteed, these statutes would be challenged in the courts because of on the ground that the compensation was inadequate. So this could result in a favorable outcome for the zamindars, and more importantly, that sort of litigation would have taken a long time, during which time social progress would come to us would be delayed. It was also felt that having a uniform obligation to pay compensation would make the abolition of the zamindari system almost an impossibility. So some people wanted to create a distinction between acquisition of property for government use, where the government might pay full value of the property, and the acquisition of property for for public purposes, which involve the interests of large groups of people, and in such a case the state would pay nominal or no compensation. Eventually, as a compromise, Article 19(1)(f) was incorporated in the Fundamental Rights chapter of the Constitution. This article provides that all citizens shall have the right to acquire, hold, and dispose of property. The right under Article 19(1)(f) was subject to reasonable restrictions imposed in the public interest by Article 19(5). Article 31 was also incorporated in the Constitution, which prohibited the acquisition of property except by the authority of a valid law. Article 31(2) thus codified the power of eminent domain of the state, permitting acquisitions of property by the state for a public purpose and on payment of compensation for such acquisition. The interesting thing is that Article 31(2) provides no guarantee of an entitlement to full compensation. This is because the Constituent Assembly felt that the court should not be concerned with the question of adequacy of compensation from the point of market value. The judgment of Parliament to acquire land was not to be interfered with unless the inadequacy of compensation was, I quote, so gross as to tantamount to a fraud on the fundamental right to own property. Even with the vague Article 31(2), it was found that the state could not afford to pay zamindars for vast pieces of land owned by them, and this led to land reform being stalled for a fair number of years until Sardar Patel's death. So, in 1950, after Patel's death, the Nehru government, in keeping with socialist principles, amended the constitution to insert Articles 31A and 31B. Article 31A provided immunity from judicial review of acquisitions of zamindaris and abolition of permanent settlements. Thus, no law that affected the rights of a proprietor or intermediate holder in an estate could be invalidated on the ground of inconsistency with the fundamental rights laid down in Part 3. Article 31B was of retrospective character, and it validated acts or regulations included in the ninth schedule from invalidity on the ground of infringement of fundamental rights contained in Part 3 of the Constitution. This meant that an act which had been held unconstitutional and void by a prior judicial decision could be validated with retrospective effect. Such a protection also extended to notifications issued in exercise of the powers conferred by these legislations. In the next 2 decades, there was constant tussle between the legislature and the judiciary on the right to property. The judiciary sought to interpret property rights in a liberal manner, while the government sought to redefine property rights in accordance with its agenda of economic development, which was based on agrarian and land reforms. We shall discuss some of the landmark cases here. In one of the first landmark cases on property rights, State of West Bengal versus Bela Banerjee, the Supreme Court gave a liberal interpretation of the requirement of compensation under Article 31(2). The court held that the government must provide adequate and just compensation to the property owner on the acquisition of land. The court believed that the owner of the land had an ethical claim to full compensation. The legislature, fearing that a liberal interpretation of the requirement to pay compensation would hinder economic reforms, amended Article 31(2) to provide that the power of the state to compulsorily acquire land cannot be challenged for lack of compensation or for its adequacy. However, the Supreme Court in the later case of Vajravelu Mudliar held that while legislation could not be challenged on the inadequacy of compensation paid for the acquisition of property, it could not provide for illusory compensation or ascertain compensation according to principles that have no relation to its value. This decision was taken as affirming the validity of Bela Banerjee, with the result that the amendment to the law was taken as having little impact. And now the tussle between the legislature and judiciary intensified with the Supreme Court decision in I.C. Golaknath versus State of Punjab. In this case, it was held that fundamental rights, including the right to property, formed a part of the basic structure of the Constitution, which cannot be amended by parliamentary legislation. Subsequently, the decision in R.C. Cooper versus Union of India followed the position in Vajravelu and refused to permit the nationalization of banks to go forward on the basis that the compensation provided was illusory. Now, the Parliament did not keep quiet. In response to these decisions, it enacted the 24th and the 25th constitutional amendments, by which the power of the state to acquire property was cemented. The word compensation in Article 31(2) was substituted with amount. The idea behind that amendment was that the citizens' right to property should be transformed into a um, state's right to acquire property, and that the state should not be hindered in its ability to in its power to deprive anyone of property in return for any amount of money payable at any point of time on any terms, and executive action um, acquiring property should not be subjected to the scrutiny of the judiciary. The 25th Constitutional Amendment, also put in place Article 31C, by which the acquisition of land by the government could not be voided because it seemed to violate Articles 14, 19, and 31. This article effectively effectively had the effect of abrogating the fundamental rights. It gave a blank charter to the parliament and to the state legislatures to ignore the fundamental rights, and secondly it subordinated fundamental rights to directive principles of state policy. The conflict between the legislature and the judiciary continued till the decision in Keshwanand Bharati versus State of Kerala, where the parliament's power to amend the constitution was circumscribed by the basic structure doctrine. The parliament could not alter the basic structure of the constitution. While this decision held that the fundamental rights form part of the basic structure of the constitution, the right to property was held not to form part of this unamendable core. Thus, the right to property could be amended by the parliament at its will. Subsequently, the 44th Amendment to the Constitution, enacted in 1978, repealed Article 19(1)(f) and Article 31. The effect of this amendment was to prevent challenges to the constitutionality of any law or order on the ground that it infringed the fundamental right to property. The amendment is only prospective in nature, so any law made prior to the amendments coming into force could still be challenged under Article 19(1)(f) and Article 31. The 44th Amendment also inserted Article 300A into the Constitution, which incorporated the content of Article 31(1). Thus, Article 300A provides that no person shall be deprived of their property except by law. Thus, you can see that the right to property was demoted from being a fundamental right to being a constitutional right. With the repeal of Article 31, there was no provision in the Constitution which provided for the power of eminent domain. So that vacuum was filled in by the colonial legislation, the Land Acquisition Act 1894, which has since then been used extensively for acquiring land for public purposes. The Land Acquisition Act enables public officials to compulsorily acquire such land if such acquisition is necessary for a public purpose. Compensation to be provided for such acquisition is determined by public officials in accordance with the market value of the land. The Land Acquisition Act has led to much litigation in the courts on the policy of acquisition of land by the government. A lot of these cases have dealt with the definition of the term public purpose and the adequacy of compensation. It's been argued that the term public purpose has been subject to much abuse and has been interpreted liberally by the courts in recent times to cover even any purpose wherein even a fraction of the community may be interested or by which it may be benefited. One author reports that public purpose has been even defined to mean employment, thus enabling more or less every public or private project to meet this requirement. Thus, one can see that land has been acquired for special economic zones, mines, factories, dams, and even for shopping malls. Similarly, under the Land Acquisition Act, there has been a lot of ambiguity in defining what compensation is. Courts in recent times have held that adequate compensation must be given in case of acquisition, An arbitrary acquisition of land by the state would not be valid. But while the Land Acquisition Act provides for consideration of market value, the task of determining a fair value for land has been left to the judges, often resulting in undervaluation of land. Also, the Land Acquisition Act has been widely criticized as not considering the rights of communities displaced by development. Thus, what you can see is that the right to property has had a very uneasy position within the framework of development. While it was restricted initially for implementing the government's agenda of abolition of the zamindari system and land reforms, it's now been sidelined for promoting the program of economic growth and development. So, in the latter agenda, there's been a wide use of the power of expropriation to transfer land to private enterprises as long as the purpose for which the acquisition is made results in some benefit to the community. Now we shall discuss the right to property as recognized in the United States. The drafters of the United States Constitution saw the right to property as a fundamental human right. Therefore, the property rights regime was given protection through two provisions in the Constitution, the Due Process Clause and the Takings Clause. The Due Process Clause guarantees that no person shall be deprived of his or her property without due process of law. The Takings Clause prohibits the acquisition of property by the government for public use without paying compensation. Both these clauses restrict the ability of the state to interfere with the right to property and concentrate property ownership in the hands of a few individuals. Property rights as protected by the US Constitution are circumscribed by two powers. One is the police power, which is the power of the government to secure rights of citizens, and the second is the power of eminent domain, which is codified in the Takings Clause, by virtue of which the government can compulsorily acquire private property for public use on payment of just compensation. Under the US Constitution, the police powers are left with the states. Therefore, the states have the power to regulate the conduct and property of citizens in the interests of public health, safety, welfare, and morals, subject to the limitations on the power by the people or by a higher constitutional authority. Now, while exercising the police power, public needs are considered paramount, and therefore it is determined that private rights, including the right to property, must be subordinated to the broader public purpose. So, when the state acts in the exercise of its police power, even though loss may be suffered by the individual, compensation is not payable. In reviewing state police power regulations, courts have applied a rational basis standard. That is, the regulation is presumed to be constitutional and is upheld if it has a reasonable relation with legitimate government purposes and is not arbitrary in nature. The power of eminent domain, on the other hand, is contained in the Takings Clause of the Fifth Amendment. Property can be acquired by the government in two ways. One is through condemning the property and taking the title to it, and the second is through regulatory takings, where the government takes the use of the property, leaving the title with the owner. In the United States, as it transformed from an agrarian to an industrial economy, the power of eminent domain was used very liberally, permitting compulsory acquisitions of land by the government for not just strictly public uses but also for transfers to other private parties. The Supreme Court had, as far back in 1789, held that the power of eminent domain should not be used to effect a private transfer of property. But what has happened in reality is that legislatures and courts have permitted the use of the power of eminent domain for transferring property to even a private party as long as there was some public purpose involved in such transfer. This continued throughout the 18th and 19th century, where the power of eminent domain was used to transfer land to private companies so as to enable the growth of public infrastructure, public utilities, etc. Such takings were permitted by courts on the ground that the transfer of property to private companies benefited the public. The undermining of property rights continued on into the 21st century till the United States Supreme Court decision in Kelo versus City of New London. In Kelo, the Supreme Court held that the power of eminent domain could be used to acquire property for the purpose of economic development. Thus, economic development would satisfy the requirement of public use. The decision in Kelo enabled property to be transferred to a private party for the purpose of economic development. Thus, the court found that if a particular activity undertaken by a private entrepreneur resulted in some uh, benefits such as creation of jobs, increase in revenues to the government, revitalization of a particular sector or a particular area, then it qualifies as a public use. The decision in Kelo was very widely criticized and triggered the enactment of new laws by almost every state legislature in the United States, restricting the power of eminent domain. So it's seen that the experience in the United States has very close parallels with the development of property rights in India. Now, the broad conclusion that we derive from this lecture is that there has been a close relation between the protection of property rights and economic development. You see this from the case in all the from the experience of all the three jurisdictions, where as the development of public infrastructure and utilities was underway, a wide definition of public purpose or public use was used to justify the transfer of land even to private parties.